Good evening. Another round of applause for Rich and Jenny and their family. Providing the space is a real gift to the community. I'm going to read a portion of chapter 1 of my book, John Cleese Saved My Life, and Other True Tales of Pop Politics and Prayer. If you are interested in just talking about anything having to do with 80s pop culture, music, or history, and just want to nerd out afterwards, you can meet me over there and be happy to chat you up. Again, this is from a chapter called Land of Confusion. The deliberations went on for what seemed like an eternity. It was now dark outside and bedtime was fast approaching. At last glimpse, my folks and the visitor were hunched over a table strewn with papers featuring brightly colored charts and images. From the hushed tones seeping through the adjacent wall and into my bedroom, one could have imagined they were planning a bank heist or some other clandestine military operation. But I knew it was something even more serious. I paced nervously, stopping intermittently to put my ear to the wall in a futile attempt to predict the outcome of this most important meeting. Will they, or won't they? Suddenly, the sound of chairs being pushed in was followed by murmured adult pleasantries about the weather and whatnot. Finally, the front door closed and locked, the metal chain scraping into place. Silence. My sister Stacy and I slowly opened our bedroom doors simultaneously, peered out, and gave each other a knowing nod. It was time to learn the truth. We made our way to the kitchen where elation or devastation awaited us. Well, did we or didn't we? Stacy blurted out. For a 7-year-old, she didn't waste any time waiting for her older brother to take the lead. Yeah, did we get it? I clumsily echoed. We got it, my dad said plainly. He was clearly exhausted and already entertaining second thoughts about what had just transpired with the visitor. For 30 days, if we decide we don't like it, we can cancel it. Stacy and I erupted with joy. We high-fived until we nearly sprained our wrists while we danced and laughed all the way back to our bedrooms. As siblings, we seldom agreed on much, but we were perfectly united on this issue. Don't like it? Don't like it? Was Dad kidding? We finally got it! I did another dance, jumped into bed, and even screamed into my pillow before turning off the light. I lay there grinning myself to sleep, whispering those words over and over. We finally got it. We finally got cable. I was raised on television. As far as I can remember, TV was an ubiquitous part of my life. If George Martin was the fifth Beatle, TV was the fifth Bear. It was the first appliance turned on when I got home from school, and it stayed on during dinner, right through bedtime. The muted laugh tracks of corny sitcoms and the clattering and repetitive commercials reverberating from the living room were my audio escorts to dreamland. On Saturdays, the TV beckoned me from my slumber with a promise of hours of nonstop animated entertainment. Saturday morning commercials intended as interruptions were 30-second glimpses of the latest Cleese must-have toy Disney snack, and they were not to be missed. This meant I hit the bathroom, got my Frosted Flakes, and hunkered down until the shows were over. The amount of TV I watched was excessive, to say the least. I recall no strict parental prohibitions with hourly allotments or limits on the number of shows watched per day. My dad was concerned, however, with how close my sister and I sat to the TV. We either sat too close that we blocked his view, or he worried that we'd permanently damage our eyes. Whatever the reason, he took swift and decisive action. Grabbing the nearest roll of masking tape, he created a carpeted moat in front of the TV set. A 3-foot chasm now separated our eyes from the screen. His sight line and our sight were saved. Throughout the 1980s, I watched intently, eyes glued to the screen as the decade of my childhood unfolded. Important world-defining moments such as the Lake Placid Miracle on Ice, the Challenger disaster, and the fall of the Berlin Wall all became permanent fixtures in the various corridors of my mind. It's no coincidence then that one of the earliest memories has to do with an event that dominated the airwaves. The boldest and most vivid images are of 3 men. One, an angry-looking man with a gray beard and a black towel on his head. He never smiled, but the crowds he spoke to were always cheering for him. Another man, a reporter, had hair that did not move and a collar that was so tight I thought his head might pop off at any moment. The third man had long hair and a mustache like some of the teenagers who lived on my block. This man liked to sing about trees with yellow ribbons tied around them. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized who these men were and why I associated them together. One thing was certain: I would be the only one who would find these images difficult to forget. Their identities: the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ted Koppel, and Tony Orlando. The event: the Iranian hostage crisis. Confusion and questions dominated my young mind. What's in Iran? Why are people burning American flags? Why are they so angry? What did the Americans do to get grounded? When will my cartoons stop getting interrupted? Early onset introversion and only 4 channels on the tube guaranteed I would forsake the outdoors and ride out the news flash updates about hostages until Scooby-Doo returned. In the process, I became kind of a hostage myself. The students who took over the U.S. Embassy 6,000 miles away were also taking over my living room. I was left to inadvertently soak up the visual turmoil and political intrigue, to endure it and process it at a much later date. TV was not only responsible for intense political confusion as I considered for the first time a world outside of America, but for animating my first independent questions about religion and the nature of God. It wasn't long after the hostage crisis that I'd had my first existential crisis. I managed to see the movie Gandhi numerous times on HBO, just never in one sitting. In my frequent channel flipping, I watched as much of the 3-hour epic as my attention span, schedule, and impatient friends would allow. Half hour here, 10 minutes there. As the dramatic bits and pieces of Gandhi's life unfolded, I became captivated by his courage, compassion, and devotion. I wrestled with my newfound admiration for someone who was not a Christian and who, according to the teachings of my church, was getting raked over the hottest coals in the deepest and darkest corner of hell. Part of me wondered if Satan himself was using Sir Richard Attenborough's film to trick me and lead me astray. If I thought Gandhi was good, would I go to hell too? Based on the movie and what I was learning in Sunday school, I concluded Gandhi and Jesus would have been pals had their lives overlapped. After all, hadn't the Romans and the British created societies where justice was lacking and the messages of both the Messiah and the Mahatma were needed? Yeah, I figured Jesus would be keeping pace with Gandhi on the Salt March, and Gandhi would be alongside the disciples passing out loaves and fishes. It seemed unfair to me that someone like Gandhi, who though technically a Hindu, lived his life exactly how Jesus said we should. Turn the other cheek, love your enemies, help the poor, and so on. So the idea of Gandhi being in hell didn't sit well with me at all. I just couldn't accept it. I stewed over this for a couple of years, trying to get to the root of my confusion and formulate the words to express my opposition to the bedrock of conservative Lutheran belief. Jesus was the only way. All others need not apply. An opportunity to get some clarity finally presented itself one evening during the weekly youth group night at my church. It was billed as Ask the Pastor Night. We could write a question about any moral or theological quandary we happened to be facing, and the pastor would give some sound biblical guidance on the matter. It would be anonymous, so we were told to be honest, and that no subject was off limits. Aha, here's my chance. After we gathered for prayers, and we were given some time to write and deposit our questions in a bucket for the pastor to draw out and answer. I did my best to articulate my issues with the exclusivity of salvation and the fate of Gandhi and his fellow Hindus on a 3x5 note card. I wrote the following. To get to heaven, you must believe Jesus is your Savior and died for your sins, right? Well, what about the people that lived and died before the time of Christ, or existed in a different part of the world, or just never even heard of Jesus, or believed in a different religion? Are they going to hell just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time? What happened to these people after they died? I dutifully folded my note card and dropped it in the bucket. Feelings of relief and anticipation ebbed and flowed. Though I had finally gotten these thoughts off my chest and sent them to a reliable source, my nerves were frayed at the prospect of failing to understand whatever answer awaited me. As it would turn out, I needn't have wasted my time worrying. One by one, the pastor addressed the inevitable teen wonderings about God's stance on drugs, premarital sex, and the latest Ozzy Osbourne record. At one point, I noticed he unfolded a note card, furrowed his brow, and dropped it back in the bucket. I didn't think anything of it until a short time later when he finally announced, "Well, that's all of them." He thanked us for our questions, told us to keep praying, and brought the evening to a close. I was so stunned that it took me several minutes to realize the note card he tossed back was my question. My deepest spiritual question, tossed back like a fish too small to keep. Why didn't he read it? Did he not think I would understand? I felt even more confused about religion and the role of God in my life. How was I supposed to get and stay saved when the guy God puts in charge can't or won't help me? Like many, I was duped into believing the 1960s were the preeminent decade of the 20th century. Now, media of the 1980s was so saturated with romanticized and idealized 60s-based TV shows and movies that I felt I was born in the wrong decade. My generation would never be able to compete with all the 60s awesomeness. I missed out on all the excitement and the groovy revolution, etc., etc. My parents' generation had bragging rights to the truest, deepest, most important music of all time. From all corners, the message was loud and clear. No future time period would ever be as groovy and righteous as that again. So pervasive and omnipresent were the 1960s, it seemed, if you can't beat them, join them, was the only response to the baby boomer onslaught upon my delicate young psyche. So join them I did. I tie-dyed t-shirts with friends and fantasized about being a hippie, hitchhiking across America, and finding myself, whatever the hell that meant. Naturally, unlike the 1960s, the 1980s was largely, or has largely avoided being excessively romanticized and looked upon with dewy-eyed nostalgia. Sure, there are occasionally bemused retrospectives and some dabbling in the kitschier elements of 80s pop culture, shows like Stranger Things, The Goldbergs, The Sounds of the Weekend, Arcade Fire, and Lady Gaga channeling her inner and outer Madonna, to name a few. Journalist Daniel Ast observed that the decade, quote, merits at best a grim shake of the head. We recall it without fondness as a period of orgiastic consumption presided over by a claymation president bent on crushing the poor, engorging the rich, and impoverishing future generations. A time of crooked financiers, shuffling and reshuffling assets. Sound familiar? Of debt and deception and the selling of our birthright to the Japanese. Toss in the erosion of faith and trust in organized religion, courtesy of the spiritual hucksterism and hypocrisy of assorted televangelists, and you have a decade more hellish than heavenly. If things were so awful, where was the righteous indignation, the protests, the marches, and more importantly, where were the artistic beacons of hope to articulate the anger and frustration of the masses? The Dylans, the Oaks, the Baezes, the Sly Stones. In truth, they were there, just waiting to be scattered across the FM dial and beamed into our living rooms by a fledgling MTV. There only needed to be a ripening of resolve, a cultural tipping point. The political flirtations and eventual ascension of a B-movie Hollywood actor to the White House would be that moment. On January 20th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan stepped to the microphone to deliver his inaugural address. His frigid breath delivered one of the most iconic sound bites in modern political history, one that even today passes the lips of conservative pundits with the regularity of the healthiest of bowels. Quote, in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. As I revisit this mantra, I arrive at a different interpretation, one that not only explains the resurgence and prolific nature of 80s activism, both in the streets and in pop culture, but one that is empowering, unifying, and nonpartisan. Here, Reagan's declaration is an unconscious call to arms, to be absorbed, internalized, and then put into action. It is an invitation to join with and rely on neighbors and like-minded organizations for solutions. And as his policies would wreak havoc on people's lives, both domestically and abroad, Reagan unintentionally invited criticism and opposition from all those who considered his administration to be the problem. Those would include artists who would use their fame and platform to make music that would reflect the times and raise awareness of a wide array of important issues with a tenacity and imagination that would far exceed their 60s predecessors.